She had been told the Duke of Ravenmore did not smile, but no one had warned her that his eyes held the particular coldness of a man who had already buried everything he ever loved. Before we go any further into this breathtaking story, we would love to know, where in the world are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments below, because stories like this one deserve to be shared across every corner of the earth. And if you are new here, please take just a moment to like this video, share it with someone who loves a deeply emotional romance, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss another story that moves your soul. Now let us return to Alara, to Ravenmore, and to the bargain that would change everything. The year was 1843, and England wore its autumn like a widow, all muted color and quiet resignation, the trees stripped their warmth, the sky the precise shade of pewter that promised nothing good. It was into this gray and grieving landscape that Alara Voss traveled alone, her single trunk strapped to the back of a hired carriage, her gloved hands folded in her lap with the practiced stillness of a woman who had long since learned that falling apart was a luxury she could not afford. She was 23 years old. She was clever, and she was tired, and she was afraid, though she would sooner have walked barefoot across Ravenmore's frost-hardened grounds than let a single soul see it. Her father, Dr. Aldrich Voss, had once been a man of considerable reputation in the village of Heswick, a physician known for his steady hands and steadier character. That was before the scandal, before the patient who had died under his care turned out to be the nephew of a magistrate, before the inquiry that followed, which had been less about justice and more about the particular cruelty that men of power reserve for men without it. Aldrich Voss had been stripped of his practice, his standing, and finally, with a quietness that broke something in Alara that she had never quite been able to name, his will to continue. He had taken to his bed 18 months ago and had not meaningfully risen from it since. The debts, however, had risen in his place. They had risen with a vigor and industry that Alara might have admired under different circumstances. The cottage, the furniture, the small garden her mother had planted before she died, all of it had been mortgaged or sold or promised to men who knocked at inconvenient hours and left without warmth. There was nothing left, or rather, there had been nothing left until the letter arrived. It came on a Tuesday, delivered by a footman in Ravenmore livery, whose very posture communicated that he was accustomed to better errands. The letter was brief, as all truly consequential things tend to be. It bore the seal of Edmund Ashford, Duke of Ravenmore, and it requested, no, it summoned, Miss Alara Voss to present herself at Ravenmore Hall at her earliest convenience to discuss a matter of mutual benefit. She had spent 2 days turning that phrase over in her mind. Mutual benefit. It was the language of contracts, of ledgers, of men who had translated everything, even human beings, into columns of gain and loss. She had gone, of course. She had gone because the alternative was to remain in the cottage and watch her father dwindle, and she was not made of the particular stuff required to do that, without trying everything else first. Ravenmore Hall appeared through the carriage window like something conjured rather than constructed. A vast Jacobean estate crouched at the edge of a moor, its stone facade darkened by decades of English weather, its chimneys exhaling thin ribbons of smoke against the colorless sky. It was a house of considerable grandeur and zero warmth, and as the carriage wheels crunched across the gravel approach, Alara felt, quite distinctly, the sensation of a door closing somewhere deep inside her chest. She was shown inside by a housekeeper named Mrs. Doyle, a small, precise woman with kind eyes that she kept carefully professional, as though sentiment was something she was permitted only off duty. The entrance hall was extraordinary, black and white marble floors, a staircase of dark oak that swept upward with aristocratic certainty, and everywhere, the quiet, pervasive presence of morning. Not ostentatious black crape, nothing so obvious as that. It was subtler, the way the house breathed, the way the light fell, the way no room seemed to expect laughter. The Duke kept her waiting for 11 minutes. She counted. When he entered the study where she had been placed, Alara's first thought was that grief had made him magnificent in the most terrible way, as though suffering, in sufficient quantities, carved away everything soft and left only the essential shape of a man. Edmund Ashford was perhaps 35, tall and dark-haired, with a kind of bone structure that portraiture had always favored and real life rarely produced. His eyes were the color of deep water, gray-green and utterly unreadable, and they assessed her with a thoroughness that was not unkind, precisely, but was entirely impersonal. He looked at her the way one looks at a proposed solution to a problem. Miss Voss. He did not invite her to sit. He stood by the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel, and regarded her across the width of the room. I will not waste your time with pleasantries, as I have found them to be, in the main, a waste of everyone's time. I will tell you what I require, and you will tell me whether you are capable of providing it. Is that acceptable? Alara held his gaze. You have not yet told me what you require, Your Grace. Something moved briefly across his face, not quite surprise, not quite approval. It was gone before she could name it. I require a wife, he said. A temporary one. The situation is this. My title, my estates, and a significant portion of my holdings are entailed. I have no heir. I am 36 years old. My solicitors have made clear, with increasing urgency, that the matter must be addressed before I become. He paused with the very faintest trace of dark humor. Inconveniently deceased without succession. Alara said nothing. She waited. I have no intention of remarrying in any meaningful sense, he continued, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who has made a decision in grief and calcified around it. My first marriage was, another pause, this one heavier, sufficient. I do not intend to repeat the experience. What I propose is a legal arrangement. You will marry me. You will bear me an heir. When that obligation is fulfilled, you will be provided with a more than generous settlement, a property of your choosing within reason, and the freedom to live as you please, privately, discreetly, and separately from this house and this family. Your father's debts will be cleared immediately upon our marriage. His medical reputation, I have the means to restore, should his health recover sufficiently for it to matter. The fire crackled. Somewhere distant in the house, a clock measured out the seconds with solemn indifference. You want a brood mare, Alara said. The Duke's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I want a legal arrangement entered into by two consenting adults, who each require something the other can provide. And if the child is a girl, we continue until the arrangement produces a son. He said it without cruelty, which was almost worse. He said it the way one discusses weather patterns, as though she were not a woman who would carry that child and birth it, and love it whether he wanted her to or not. Alara looked at him for a long moment. She thought of her father's hands, which had once been so capable and were now so still. She thought of the men who knocked at the cottage door. She thought of the life she had imagined, not a grand life, not a duchess's life, simply a life in which she might one day be chosen by someone who looked at her and saw her, and not a problem requiring resolution. She set that imagined life aside. She had become very practiced at setting things aside. I have conditions, she said. The Duke's eyes sharpened. Do you? I will not be made invisible in my own home, however temporarily it is mine. I will be treated with dignity by your staff and by you. I will have access to the library, the grounds, and the village. And you will tell me, once honestly, who she was. He went very still. Who? Your first wife. Alara held his gaze without flinching. The one this house is still in mourning for. The one you are doing all of this to avoid thinking about. She let one beat of silence sit between them before she added, quietly, because I will not spend however many months in a house full of her ghost without at least knowing her name. Edmund Ashford stared at her for so long that Alara thought she had miscalculated catastrophically. Her name, he said at last, very quietly, was Isadora. And just like that, in the space of a single spoken name, weighted with a sorrow she could not yet fully comprehend, Alara Voss understood that she had not merely agreed to a transaction. She had stepped into the middle of a love story that was already over, and she had no idea yet that she was about to begin one of her own. Ravenmore Hall did not simply exist, it remembered. Every corridor held the particular silence of a place that had once known laughter, and had since decided that laughter was something it could no longer afford to keep. Alara arrived as the new Duchess of Ravenmore on a Friday morning in late October. Exactly 11 days after the private ceremony that had joined her to Edmund Ashford in the eyes of God and the law, though notably absent from that ceremony had been any sense that God had been paying particular attention, and the law, as always, cared only for the signatures. The wedding itself had been conducted in the small chapel on the estate grounds, witnessed by Mrs. Doyle and Edmund's solicitor, a thin and perpetually apologetic man named Mr. Graves, whose name, Ilara had thought at the time, was either a magnificent irony or a deliberate choice by parents with a grim sense of vocation. Edmund had stood beside her at the altar with the rigid composure of a man enduring a necessary medical procedure. He had placed the ring on her finger with steady hands and spoken his vows in a voice so measured and controlled that each word might have been extracted from him individually, like stones from a field. When the vicar had pronounced them wed, there had been no kiss. Edmund had simply inclined his head, as one does at the conclusion of a successful business meeting, and turned toward the chapel door. Ilara had stared at the stained glass above the altar, a dove ascending through amber and blue light, and told herself, with great firmness, that she had not expected otherwise. She had almost believed it. Now, standing in the entrance hall of Ravenmore with her trunk being carried upstairs by a footman who moved with supernatural quiet, she took her first proper account of the house that was, for now, hers to inhabit. The grandeur was undeniable. The proportions were magnificent. The furnishings of the highest quality. Every surface attended to with a kind of meticulous care that bespoke a well-run household. And yet, there was something beneath the polish, something that breathed under the beautiful surfaces like a tide pulling perpetually outward from shore. It was grief. Settled, domestic, permanent grief, as much a feature of the house as the marble floors or the oak banisters. Mrs. Doyle guided her through the principal rooms with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had long ago made her peace with the emotional climate of her employer's home. The drawing room, the dining room, the morning room, each one appointed exquisitely, each one carrying that same quality of a stage set waiting for actors who no longer came. Fresh flowers stood in crystal vases. The hearths were lit against the autumn chill. Everything was immaculate and nothing was alive. The late Duchess favored this room, Mrs. Doyle said in the morning room, with the careful neutrality of someone who has learned to navigate a minefield by feel. His Grace has kept it much as she left it. Ilara looked around the room, the pale yellow walls, the small writing desk by the window, the embroidery frame that still held an unfinished piece of needlework, its colored threads trailing like the interrupted sentence of a woman who had simply stepped out and never come back. The sight of that unfinished embroidery did something unexpected to her chest. Not jealousy, not yet, but something almost like grief on behalf of a woman she had never known. "How long has she been gone?" Ilara asked. 3 years come January, Your Grace." Mrs. Doyle's professional neutrality softened, very briefly, around the edges. It was very sudden. Fever. She was greatly loved. The emphasis was so gentle as to be almost imperceptible. But Ilara heard it. She was greatly loved. Present tense applied to the past, which meant, of course, that it was still present. The loving, the missing, the terrible ongoing absence of a woman whose embroidery still sat in its frame, as though she might return at any moment to finish it. "Thank you, Mrs. Doyle," Ilara said. She did not look at the embroidery frame again. Her own chambers were at the far end of the east corridor, beautiful rooms, airy and well-furnished, with tall windows that looked out over the moor. Someone had placed a small arrangement of late autumn roses on the dressing table. She suspected Mrs. Doyle, and made a private note to thank her. Edmund's chambers, she had been informed with careful tactfulness, were in the opposite wing, across the length of the house. Of course, she unpacked her own trunk, dismissing the maid who hovered helpfully in the doorway, because unpacking was one of those private acts of quiet devastation that she preferred to conduct alone. Her dresses, handsome enough, but clearly the wardrobe of a physician's daughter rather than a duchess, she hung with deliberate care. Her books she arranged on the shelf. Her mother's small portrait she placed on the nightstand, because even in the most foreign of landscapes, one needed a familiar face to say good night to. Then she sat on the edge of the bed, which was vast and cloud-soft and deeply, profoundly solitary, and permitted herself exactly 5 minutes of honest reckoning. She was married to a man who was still in love with a dead woman. She was living in a house that had organized itself entirely around that dead woman's absence. She had agreed, of her own free will and in full possession of her faculties, to carry that man's child and then absent herself as tidily as possible, to become, in effect, another quiet disappearance that Ravenmore Hall would simply absorb and forget. And she had conditions, she reminded herself. She had conditions, and she had her books, and she had her 5 minutes. The 5 minutes elapsed. She stood up, straightened her dress, and went downstairs to begin the project of learning a house that did not yet know it was supposed to lure her back. She started with the portrait gallery, because the portrait gallery was unavoidable. A long corridor on the first floor lined with the collected faces of Ashford ancestors, rendered in oils of varying quality across 3 centuries. There were stern-faced earls and elaborate Jacobean collars and the occasional hunting scene. And then, near the end of the gallery, she stopped. She had known she would find her here. She had not quite prepared herself for how it would feel. Isadora Ashford, late Duchess of Ravenmore, gazed down from the largest canvas in the gallery with the calm, intelligent expression of a woman who had known her own worth and never felt the need to argue for it. She was beautiful, not conventionally, not fashionably, but with the kind of beauty that suggested architecture rather than decoration. High cheekbones, a strong, certain mouth, and her eyes, painted with a specificity that suggested the artist had considered them worthy of particular attention, were the most remarkable shade of violet. Not quite blue, not quite gray, but that in-between color that one associated with the hour before a storm, when the light turns strange and everything becomes briefly, breathtakingly vivid. Alara stood before that portrait for a long time. She was painted 2 years before she died. The voice came from behind her, and she turned to find Edmund standing at the far end of the gallery. She had not heard him approach, which seemed to be a characteristic of the man. He moved through his own house like a shadow that had learned the floorboards. He was looking not at Alara, but at the portrait, and the expression on his face was one she had not yet seen from him, unguarded, stripped of its usual precise control, raw in a way that made her feel she was witnessing something she had not been meant to see. She was 28, he continued, as though the words were being drawn out of him against his better judgment. It was commissioned for our 3rd anniversary. Alara looked back at the portrait, at those remarkable violet eyes. She looks like someone who said exactly what she thought. A pause. She did. And for just a moment, barely a flicker, barely a breath's worth of time, something that was almost a smile crossed the Duke's face. Not the dark, ironic movement she had observed before, but something softer and entirely involuntary. Something that belonged to a different version of him. She was never once intimidated by anything in her life, including me. The not-quite smile faded as quickly as it had come. His jaw reset. His eyes returned to their customary gray remoteness. "I trust your rooms are satisfactory, Your Grace." The title in his mouth, directed at her, sat strangely, as though they were both aware of its inadequacy. "They are. Thank you." He inclined his head and turned to leave, and she let him go, because she was still learning the geography of this man, where the hollows were, where the walls stood, which corridors were passable, and which led nowhere but locked doors. She turned back to the portrait, to Isadora's violet eyes. "I'm not here to replace you," she said quietly, to a woman who could not hear her, in a gallery that was very good at keeping secrets. "I am not sure entirely what I am here for, but I promise you it is not that." The painted eyes looked back with their particular, eternal serenity. Outside the tall gallery windows, the moor stretched away into the gathering dusk, vast and gray and indifferent and somehow, Alara thought, entirely honest in a way that the house was not yet ready to be. She pulled her shawl more tightly around her shoulders and went to find the library. Because if Ravenmore Hall was going to be her world, however temporarily, she intended to know every room of it. Even the rooms she was not supposed to enter. Even the rooms that were still waiting, 3 years on, for a woman who was never coming home. There is a particular kind of loneliness that is worse than solitude, and it is the loneliness of being in the same room as someone who has decided, with great thoroughness and personal conviction, that you do not quite exist. Elara came to understand this with increasing clarity over the first weeks of her marriage, as the rhythms of Ravenmore Hall settled around her like sediment finding the bottom of still water. The house had its patterns: breakfast at 8, Edmund departing immediately after for his study or his estate business, luncheon taken separately, as though communal midday meals might create a dangerous precedent of companionship, dinner at 7, which was the one occasion when the architecture of their arrangement required them to occupy the same room for longer than the length of a passing remark. Dinner, consequently, became the hour Elara studied him. She did it carefully, obliquely, the way one observes a wild thing that is not yet decided whether you are a threat, noting the way he held his wine glass by the stem rather than the bowl, the way he read correspondence at the table with the focused intensity of a man who used work as other men used armor, the way he occasionally paused mid-sentence when a memory seemed to pass through him like a cold current, leaving him briefly still before he gathered himself and continued. He was not cruel to her. She wanted to be precise about that because cruelty would have been, in some ways, easier to navigate. Cruelty has edges you can map. Edmund Ashford was not cruel. He was simply absent, in the most complete and considered sense of the word, present at the table, present in the house, and yet conducting himself with the absolute emotional containment of a man who had drawn a perimeter around himself and fully intended to maintain it. He had made the terms of their arrangement clear on the second evening of her residence at Ravenmore, when he had requested her presence in his study after dinner with the formal courtesy of a man summoning his solicitor. The study was a room that suited him, dark-paneled, ordered, smelling of wood smoke and old books, and something faintly mineral that she later identified as the particular scent of the moor when the wind came from the north. He had been standing behind his desk when she entered, and he had gestured to the chair opposite with the brief efficiency of a man conducting an interview rather than a marriage. "I want to ensure we have a clear understanding," he had said, settling into his own chair and lacing his fingers together on the desk, a gesture so controlled it seemed almost performed, as though he had rehearsed this conversation and was determined to execute it without deviation. "The terms of our arrangement as I understand them. You may correct me if I have misrepresented anything." Elara had folded her hands in her lap and said, "Please continue. You will have full access to the house, the grounds, and the village, as you requested. You will have an account at the village shops and a quarterly allowance for personal expenses. The library is at your disposal entirely. I rarely use it." Something shifted briefly in his expression at that admission, as though the confession that he no longer read was one he had not entirely meant to make. "Your father's debts have been settled as of yesterday. I have also written to 2 colleagues who may be positioned to assist in the restoration of his professional standing, should his health allow." "Thank you," Elara said, and meant it with a completeness that felt almost inconvenient. He acknowledged it with a nod and continued, "You will have your own chambers. You will have your own sitting room. My household staff will treat you with the full respect owed to the Duchess of Ravenmore, and I will make clear to them that any failure in this regard will be addressed immediately." He paused. "In return, I ask that you conduct yourself publicly in a manner befitting the title. I do not anticipate extensive public engagements. I have little appetite for society, but there will be occasions." "I understand. There is one other matter." His voice changed very slightly, not in volume, not in pace, but in a quality she could not immediately name. A degree of compression, perhaps. Something carefully weighted. "Isadora's rooms are in the east wing. They are kept locked. They are not to be entered, explored, or disturbed in any capacity." Elara looked at him steadily. "And are there other locked rooms I should be aware of?" The question hung in the air between them for a moment. "That is the only one that concerns our arrangement," he said. She wanted to ask him why he kept them locked. She wanted to ask him whether preservation was a form of love or a form of punishment, whether he was keeping Isadora's rooms as a shrine or as a wound he had decided, with grim perversity, not to let close. She wanted to ask him whether he ever stood outside that locked door in the hours when the house was asleep, because she suspected, with a certainty she could not entirely account for, that he did. She asked none of these things. She was new here. She was learning the terrain. I won't go near them, she said. You have my word. Something in him, barely perceptible, but there, eased. Very well. He unclasped his hands and reached for a document on the corner of his desk. I had my solicitor draw up a summary of the arrangement for your records. You needn't sign it. It is simply for your own clarity. She took the document. She did not look at it immediately, because she already knew what it would say. It would say, in the careful language of men trained to make human arrangements sound like property transfers, that she had agreed to provide an heir in exchange for her freedom and her father's restoration. It would say, in so many words, that she was temporary, that she was a solution, not a person. She set it on her knee and met his eyes. May I ask you something? The briefest hesitation. You may ask. When this is over, when you have your heir and I have my settlement, do you intend to be happy? The silence that followed was of a completely different quality to any silence that had come before it. It was not the silence of a man composing a careful answer. It was the silence of a man who had been struck somewhere undefended and was taking a moment to determine the extent of the damage. That is not a relevant consideration, he said at last. It seems quite relevant to me, Elara said, with perfect gentleness. You are a young man. You will presumably live for many years after this arrangement concludes. I wonder if you have given any thought to how you intend to fill them. Edmund Ashford looked at her across the ordered surface of his desk. This woman who had been in his house for 2 days and had already said more honest things to him than most people managed in a year. And for just a moment, something moved across his face that was not composure and was not grief and was not remoteness. It was something rawer and more uncertain than any of those things. Something that might, in a different man, in a different life, have been the beginning of an answer. Good night, Your Grace, he said instead. She rose, took the document, and left him to his firelight and his careful solitude. That night, in the vast and quiet bed of her borrowed chambers, Elara lay awake and listened to Ravenmore Hall settle around her. The creak of old timbers, the distant sound of wind crossing the moor, the particular deep silence of a house that had been holding its breath for 3 years. She thought about Isadora's rooms, locked and preserved in the east wing. She thought about Edmund's hands, so still on the desk, so controlled, as though stillness were something he practiced rather than felt. She thought about the unfinished embroidery in the morning room, and the portrait with the violet eyes, and the way he had said the dead woman's name on that very first afternoon, Isadora, as though the name were both a wound and the only bandage he had for it. She was not in love with him. She was careful to be clear with herself about that, because clarity was the only armor available to her in this particular situation, and she intended to maintain it scrupulously. She was not in love with him. She was simply paying attention. She was simply, as she had always been, since childhood, since her mother died and her father retreated into his books, and she had learned to read the emotional weather of a house the way other children learn to read primers, simply noticing things. She noticed, for instance, that when Edmund had said the arrangement was not about happiness, he had looked away, not to the door, not to the window, not to any of the usual escapes a man reaches for when evading a direct question. He had looked, for just a half-second, at the mantelpiece, at the small space to the left of the clock, where the faint square outline of a removed picture frame was just barely visible on the wallpaper. Something had hung there once. Something had been taken down. Elara closed her eyes and listened to the wind, and did not let herself wonder what it had been. Not yet. It is a curious thing about walls. The stronger a man builds them, the more precisely they reveal the shape of what he is trying to keep inside. November came to Ravenmore with characteristic severity, pulling the last color from the moor and replacing it with a monochrome landscape that was, Elara had begun to discover, not without its own austere beauty. She had taken to walking in the mornings, setting out after breakfast along the gravel paths that wound through the estate grounds, her breath a small cloud in the cold air, her boots crunching across the frost-stiffened grass. It was during these walks that Ravenmore began, reluctantly and incrementally, to yield its character to her. The way the moor looked almost tender in the low winter light, The way the old oaks at the northern boundary stood with the dignified patience of things that have survived every season and expect to survive many more. The way the hall itself, viewed from a distance, lost some of its severity and looked instead merely large and very, very alone. She had begun to feel, if not at home, then at least acquainted with the place. Which was, she supposed, as much as she had any right to expect. The first thing she noticed, the first crack, though she did not yet call it that, occurred on a Wednesday morning in the second week of November. She returned from her walk to find that a book had been placed outside her sitting room door. No note, no explanation, simply a volume of natural philosophy, bound in green leather, left on the floor outside her door with the quiet deliberateness of something that had been put there by a person who had thought about it more than once before acting. She picked it up and turned it over in her hands. It was not new. The spine was gently worn, the pages soft with previous reading. Someone had underlined a passage on page 47, in pencil, with the precise straight line of a person who underlines things carefully rather than impulsively. The passage read, "In nature, nothing is created and nothing is destroyed. Only the form of things changes." Beside the underlined text, in handwriting she did not yet recognize, but would come to know as intimately as her own, someone had written in the margin, "Is this consolation or cruelty?" She stood in the corridor for a moment, holding the book, looking at those 4 words in the margin. Then she carried inside, sat by her window, and read until luncheon. She did not mention the book to Edmund at dinner. Neither did he. But she noticed that he glanced very briefly at her hands when she entered the dining room, and something in his posture shifted a fraction. Not quite relief, not quite satisfaction, but some quiet version of both, when he registered that she was not carrying it. As though he had not wanted to be thanked. As though the giving had been the entirety of the point. The second crack came 10 days later, in the form of a fire. She had returned to her sitting room on a particularly bitter afternoon to find the hearth blazing with a generosity that her usual modest coal allowance did not typically produce. The room was warm, genuinely enveloping warm, the kind of warmth that makes the shoulders drop and the jaw unclench. And on the small table beside her favorite chair, someone had placed a pot of tea and a plate of the ginger biscuits she had mentioned once in passing conversation with Mrs. Doyle that she was fond of from childhood. She stood in the doorway of her own sitting room and felt, to her considerable annoyance, the distinct prickling of tears behind her eyes. She blinked them firmly away. She sat down, poured her tea, ate a ginger biscuit, and was ruthlessly practical about the entire thing. She asked Mrs. Doyle about it the following morning, with studied casualness. The housekeeper's expression arranged itself into one of careful blankness. His Grace gave instructions for your fire to be built up in the afternoons, Your Grace. He observed that the east-facing rooms lose the sun early in winter. He observed. Ilara turned this over in her mind. He had observed. He had stood somewhere, in a corridor, perhaps, or at a window, and he had looked at the east-facing wing, and he had thought about the fact that her rooms would be cold in the afternoons, and he had done something about it. Quietly. Without fanfare, without any apparent desire to be credited for it. She filed this information carefully alongside the book with a marginal notation, and said nothing, and continued to pay attention. The meals changed, too, though so gradually that she might have missed it had she not been watching. Edmund had initially maintained the rigid distances of their arrangement at the dinner table, he at one end, she at the other, the full ceremonial length of polished mahogany between them, as though proximity might be dangerous. But somewhere in the third week of November, the footman had begun laying covers at the corner of the table rather than the ends, and Edmund had sat down without comment, and they had eaten their soup a reasonable distance apart like 2 people sharing a meal rather than conducting a formal treaty negotiation. It was, objectively, a very small thing. It did not feel like a very small thing. The conversation at these closer dinners remained careful, measured, and largely impersonal, estate business, local affairs, the occasional observation about the weather, which in England provides an apparently inexhaustible resource for the socially cautious. But occasionally, with the unpredictability of a fault line shifting under apparently stable ground, something else broke through. It happened first when Alara made an observation about a passage she had read in the green leather book, a remark about the conservation of matter, and whether it applied by extension to grief. Whether grief was simply love that had lost its form and was searching for a new one. She had said it half to herself, in the way that one sometimes speaks at the dinner table when thinking aloud, and she had not expected any particular response. Edmund had set down his fork. "That is precisely the question," he said. "Not an interesting notion, or I see your point, or any of the other conversational cushions men of his class typically deployed when a woman said something that surprised them. Simply, that is precisely the question," as though she had walked into a room where he had been sitting alone with that exact thought for 3 years, and had put her hand on it without knowing. The moment lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then he picked up his fork and said something about the tenant repairs on the north boundary, and the moment closed like water closing over a stone, smooth and complete, as though it had never been disturbed. But Alara had seen it. She had felt it. And she thought about it later that night in her vast and quiet bed, turning it over with the careful attention she gave to things that mattered. December arrived, and with it the first snowfall, a light, tentative dusting that turned the more briefly luminous before the wind scattered it. Alara was in the library when it began, sitting in the deep window seat she had claimed as her own, her book open on her knee, watching the snow come down in the last gray light of the afternoon. She was so absorbed in the view that she did not hear Edmund enter, and only became aware of him when she registered, at the periphery of her senses, that the room was no longer quite empty. He had stopped just inside the doorway. He was watching the snow too, or perhaps watching her watching the snow. She was not certain which, because when she turned, his gaze moved to the window with the smooth immediacy of a man who has been caught looking and has extensive practice in the recovery. "I did not mean to disturb you," he said. "You didn't." She shifted slightly in the window seat, and then, before she had quite made a conscious decision to do it, moved her book and folded her feet beneath her to make space at the other end. Not an invitation, precisely. More an acknowledgement that the window seat was wide enough for 2 people, and the snow was worth watching, and there was no particular reason, in the abstract, why 2 people in the same library could not watch snow fall from the same window. Edmund looked at the space she had made. He looked at it for long enough that she thought he would simply retreat to his desk and his correspondence, which was, after all, the safer and more sensible option. Then he crossed the room and sat at the other end of the window seat. He did not speak. She did not speak. They watched the snow come down across the moor together, the white dissolving into the gray, the bare trees collecting thin lines of white along their branches, the whole familiar landscape made briefly, completely strange by the simple fact of the cold. And it was not comfortable exactly, because nothing between them was yet comfortable. But it was something. It was the closest thing to peaceable that they had yet managed, and it lasted for nearly 20 minutes before Edmund stood and said he had letters to attend to, and left. After he had gone, Alara sat for a long time in the window seat, alone again, watching the last of the light leave the sky. She pressed her fingertips very lightly against the cold glass. She thought, be careful. She thought, he is a man still entirely in love with someone else, and you are a woman with a contract and a departure date, and 20 minutes of shared silence in a library window is not a foundation. It is a coincidence. She thought all of these things with great firmness and considerable conviction. Then she picked up her book and smiled at the dark and snowy moor, and was ruthlessly, completely honest with herself about the fact that the smile was not about the book. There are ghosts that rattle chains and disturb the sleep of the living, and then there are the quieter kind, the ones that arrange themselves in the spaces between 2 people and make genuine closeness an act of navigation rather than instinct. Isadora Ashford was the second kind. She was everywhere and nowhere. She was in the morning room with her unfinished embroidery. She was in the portrait gallery with her violet eyes and her serene, certain mouth. She was in the way Mrs. Doyle occasionally began a sentence, the late Duchess used to, and then caught herself and redirected with the practiced smoothness of a woman who had learned, over 3 years, which subjects required careful handling. She was in the east wing, locked and preserved behind a door that Alara walked past each morning on her way to the library, and which she had kept her word about, entirely and without deviation, for 6 full weeks. It was in the 7th week that everything changed. It began, as many things at Ravenmore did, with the cold. January had arrived with punishing conviction, turning the moor into a white and wind-scoured expanse that was beautiful in the way of things that are entirely indifferent to human survival. The pipes in the East Corridor froze on a Thursday night, and the subsequent morning brought the controlled crisis of a large household managing an infrastructure emergency. Plumbers summoned from the village, footmen carrying hot water in relays, Mrs. Doyle orchestrating everything with the grim efficiency of a general conducting a particularly irritating campaign. In the disorder, Ilara had gone upstairs to retrieve a shawl she had left in her sitting room, taking the East Corridor route because the main stairs were temporarily obstructed by a plumber and his considerable quantity of equipment. She had walked quickly, her mind on the book she had left in the library and the tea that would be going cold, and she had turned the corner toward the locked east wing, and stopped. The door was open. Not flung open, not broken open. Simply open by perhaps 6 inches, the latch not quite having caught when someone had last closed it. Through that 6-inch gap, she could see the edge of a window, morning light falling through pale curtains, the corner of what appeared to be a dressing table. She stood in the corridor for a very long time. She had given her word. She had said, "I won't go near them." She had said it and she had meant it. And in 6 weeks, she had honored it without difficulty, because she was not, by nature, a person who broke her word, and because she had understood from the beginning that Isadora's rooms were a boundary that Edmund had drawn in something deeper and more permanent than ink. She reached out and pulled the door firmly closed. And then she stood with her hand on the latch for a moment, looking at the closed door, and felt, for the first time since she had come to Ravenmore, something that she was less able to dismiss as rational and more honest about naming correctly. She was jealous of a dead woman, not for Edmund's love. She was careful to be precise with herself, because she did not love him yet, or so she was maintaining with increasing effort, but for something more fundamental than that. She was jealous of Isadora's permanence, of the fact that this woman, who had been gone for 3 years, occupied more of this house, more of this man, more of the air in every room, than Ilara, who was present, breathing, alive, had any hope of occupying. She was jealous of the locked door, of the preserved rooms, of the unfinished embroidery that had not been touched, but had also not been put away, as though putting it away would constitute an admission that Isadora was genuinely, finally, irrevocably gone. It was not a feeling she was proud of. One cannot reasonably resent the dead. The dead have not set out to inconvenience anyone. But feelings, as Ilara's mother had once observed with the weary pragmatism of a woman who had raised a feeling-prone child, do not require your permission to arrive, only your discretion about what you do with them once they are there. What Ilara did with this one was carry it through the rest of the morning in silence, set it aside through luncheon, and bring it, finally, to dinner, where it sat at the table with them like a third-place setting that neither of them acknowledged. Edmund was in a communicative mood that evening, by his standards, which is to say he had asked her 2 questions about her reading and responded to her answers with more than 1 sentence each. They had spoken about natural philosophy and then, somehow, about her childhood in Heswick, and she had told him about her father's study, which had been full of medical texts and smelled of camphor, and about learning to read there among the clinical volumes, finding stories wherever she could between the anatomy diagrams. Edmund had listened with the full, focused attention she had begun to recognize as characteristic of him. He was not a man who listened partially, who let his eyes drift while his mouth made agreeable sounds. When he listened entirely. It was that quality of being fully, genuinely attended to, that made what she said next feel, in retrospect, inevitable. "The door to the east wing was open this morning," she said. "I closed it." The shift in him was immediate and total, like a candle flame in a sudden draft, there and then reorganized, still burning, but no longer quite the same shape. He set down his wine glass. "It was left open by accident," he said. His voice was level, very level, the levelness of extreme control. "I know." She held his gaze. "I didn't go in. I said I wouldn't, and I didn't." "I know you didn't." A beat. "Thank you." She should have left it there. She knew, even as she continued, that she should have left it there. The door closed again, the subject set aside, the careful equilibrium of their arrangement maintained. But the jealousy she had been carrying all day had settled into something quieter and more honest, and it was the honest thing that spoke. Edmund. She used his given name for the first time. It arrived in the air between them with a weight she had not quite anticipated. His eyes sharpened. How long do you intend to keep those rooms exactly as they were? The silence that followed was not like the comfortable silence in the library window. It was the silence of a space between two fault lines. That is not a subject I am prepared to discuss, he said. I understand that. I'm asking anyway. He looked at her, really looked at her, in the unguarded way she had learned to watch for, because it happened so rarely. And she could see it happening behind his eyes, the conflict between the fortified self and the part of him that was still, somewhere beneath all that marble and control, simply a man carrying an enormous and unprocessed grief. She has only been gone 3 years, he said, and his voice was quiet in a way that was entirely different from his usual quietness. This was not the quietness of discipline. This was the quietness of something very close to breaking. I know, Elara said just as quietly. 3 years is not. He stopped. Started again. People speak of grief as though it has a schedule, as though at some point 2 years, 5 years, a decade, you are simply expected to have completed it and moved forward and become a reasonable and functional version of yourself again. His jaw tightened. She was my wife. She was, he stopped again. The word that would have completed that sentence did not come. It stayed inside him, whatever it was, and the weight of its staying was visible in his face. She was everything, Elara said very gently. Edmund looked at her. His expression was extraordinary in its complexity, grief and anger and something that was almost gratitude, and beneath all of it, the raw, exhausted face of a man who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and was not sure any longer whether he was holding it by choice or simply because he had forgotten how to put it down. You should not have to live in a house that is organized around someone else's absence, he said. The words came out differently than she expected, not defensive, not sharp, but worn, honest. I am aware of what I must seem like. You seem like a man who loved someone very much and doesn't know what to do with that love now that she's gone, Elara said. And then, because she was Elara Voss, and she had never quite learned to leave the true thing unsaid. That is not a flaw, Edmund. It is only a problem if you decide it must be permanent. He stood abruptly, pushing back his chair with a force that was not violence, but was close to it. The force of a man who needed to move because staying still had become unbearable. He went to the window and stood with his back to her, his hands clasped behind him, and she could see the effort of containment in the set of his shoulders, the rigid line of his spine. You overstep, he said. I know. This arrangement does not entitle you to. I know. Her voice was steady and quiet. And yet I said it, and I meant it, and I believe you know that I'm right. The silence stretched. The fire in the dining room hearth shifted and settled. Outside, the January wind moved across the moor with its usual disregard for the difficulties of human beings. When Edmund turned back from the window, his face had returned to its usual composure. But it was not, quite, the same composure as before. Something had been said that could not be unsaid. Something had moved, however slightly, in the deep and frozen strata of the man. Good night, Your Grace, he said. Good night, she answered. He left. She sat at the dinner table alone, the candles burning down around her, and pressed her palms flat against the cool surface of the mahogany. She thought, I have made him angry. She thought, no. I have made him feel, which is not the same thing, though it can feel identical from the inside, She thought, be careful, Elara. And she thought, for the first time, with a clarity that was almost frightening. It may already be too late for that. Upstairs in the east wing, behind the door she had closed and kept closed, Isadora's rooms stood in their preserved and careful dark, the curtains drawn, the dressing table undisturbed, the air holding the last molecules of a woman who had laughed and breathed and loved, and then, too suddenly and too soon, had simply stopped. And in the portrait gallery, in the low and silver light of the winter moon that came through the tall windows, Isadora's painted violet eyes looked out across the darkened hall with their eternal, unreadable serenity, as though they, too, were waiting to see what would happen next. There are nights that arrive in disguise, wearing the ordinary clothes of wind and cold and inconvenience, and only reveal themselves for what they truly are long after they are over. When you look back and understand that everything that came before them was simply the world arranging itself into position. The storm came on a Friday evening in late January, descending on Ravenmoor with the sudden, absolute authority of a force that has decided it will not be reasoned with. It announced itself first as a change in pressure, the particular heaviness in the air that the moor seemed to exhale before violence, and then as wind, building from the north with a persistence that rattled the shutters of the hall and sent the servants moving through the corridors, closing things, fastening things, preparing for the particular domestic siege that a Yorkshire winter occasionally required. Ilara had been in the library since mid-afternoon, unaware of the storm's approach until the light through the tall windows turned the peculiar yellow-gray of serious weather, and the first real gust hit the glass, with a sound like a flat palm striking a table. She looked up from her book, looked at the windows, and understood within moments that the kind of evening she had planned, quiet, solitary, the familiar comfort of her own chambers and her own fire, was not the evening she was going to have. The lamp on the library table flickered, dimmed. Then, with a finality that suggested the weather had made a decision, went out entirely. 3 seconds later, the sconces on the wall followed. The library plunged into darkness broken only by the firelight from the large hearth at the room's far end, which was, at least, burning with the committed vigor of a fire that had been properly laid and had no intention of being easily defeated. Ilara sat for a moment in the sudden dimness, listening to the storm announce itself against the windows, and then made the practical decision to move to the hearth, taking her book and the blanket she had appropriated from the window seat and arranging herself in one of the 2 wing-back chairs that faced the fire. She would wait out the worst of it here. The library was warm. She had her book, and while the firelight was not ideal for reading, it was sufficient, and she had read in worse conditions. She had been settled for perhaps 20 minutes, long enough for the storm to graduate from serious to genuinely alarming, the wind now producing a sound around the eaves of Ravenmoor that was less meteorological phenomenon and more like something with intentions, when the library door opened and Edmund came in. He stopped when he saw her. She looked up from her book. They regarded each other across the firelit room with the mutual surprise of 2 people who had each believed themselves to be seeking solitude and have discovered that the same instinct has delivered them to the same location. "The power is out in the east wing," he said, by way of explanation, "and the west corridor. Mrs. Doyle has the staff managing the household lamps." He held up the single candle he carried, which was doing its modest best against the surrounding dark. The library hearth was, he paused. "I assumed it would be empty." "It usually is at this hour," Ilara agreed. She looked at him, then at the wing-back chair on the other side of the hearth, then back at him. And because they had come some small distance since the early weeks, and because the storm outside was producing sounds that made solitude seem less appealing than it had 20 minutes ago, she said, "There are 2 chairs." Edmund looked at the second chair. He looked at it with the expression of a man conducting a brief but serious internal negotiation. Then he came and sat in it. He set his candle on the table between them, where it added its small light to the firelight, and he did not bring a book or correspondence or any of the usual armor with which he furnished his solitary hours. He simply sat, his long legs extended toward the fire, his hands resting on the chair arms, and looked at the flames with the focused attention of a man who has decided, for this particular evening, to simply be in a room. For a while they were quiet. The storm spoke for them, elaborately, at considerable volume, with dramatic emphasis. The windows shook. Something on the roof made a series of alarming sounds, and then appeared to resolve whatever situation it had been having. The fire responded to drafts in the chimney by periodically flaring into extraordinary brightness and then settling back to its steady burn, and each time it flared it through their shadows large and flickering against the bookshelves. It was Edmund who spoke first. "Are you frightened of storms?" Ilara considered the question with the seriousness it apparently deserved, coming from a man who asked very few questions. "No. I find them clarifying somehow. Everything becomes very simple during a storm. There is the storm, and there is not the storm, and everything that seemed complicated resolves into one or the other. He was quiet for a moment. Isadora was terrified of them. The words came out with the quality of something that had not been planned, a confidence that had escaped before the usual checkpoints could intercept it. He seemed to register this because his jaw tightened briefly, but he did not retract it. She would not admit it. She was not a woman who admitted to fear easily. But during storms, she always found a reason to be in the same room as someone else. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind made its tremendous and indifferent argument. She sounds, Elara said carefully, like someone who was very good at being strong and very human about the parts of herself that weren't. Edmund turned his head to look at her. In the firelight, his face was different. The severity softened, the shadows doing something to the hard planes of his features that daylight never managed. Yes, he said. That is, yes. Exactly that. A log shifted in the grate, sending a small cascade of sparks upward. The storm shouldered against the windows, and something in the quality of the silence between them changed, became less guarded, less structured, as though the storm had simply made the usual architecture of their restraint impractical. The way a flood makes roads impassable and forces travelers to find new routes. "Can I ask you something?" Edmund said. It was the first time he had asked her for permission to speak, and the novelty of it, this reversal of their usual dynamic, was not lost on her. "Of course. Why did you agree to this arrangement?" He was looking at the fire again, his voice carrying the studied evenness of a man asking a question he genuinely wants answered, but is not entirely sure he has the right to ask. You are clearly not without options. You are intelligent and capable and not without your own kind of—" He paused, searching for the word with a precision that suggested he was unwilling to use an imprecise one. "Presence. You could have found another way." Elara was quiet for a moment. She thought about giving him the practical answer. The debts, her father, the absence of alternatives, because those things were true. But in the firelight, in the storm, with the usual careful distances dissolved by weather and proximity, and the simple fact of two people sharing warmth on a cold night, the practical answer felt like a kind of dishonesty. "My father was disappearing," she said. "Not just physically, though that too. But the man he was, the man who had taught me everything, who had held our family together after my mother died, who had believed for 50 years that the world was essentially a place worth tending. That man was going out like a lamp with no oil, and I could not find any other way to refill it." She paused. "And I think I also chose it, because a part of me believed that difficulty was not the same as worthlessness, that something hard to enter was not necessarily wrong to enter." She looked at the fire. "I have not yet decided whether that was wisdom or stubbornness." Edmund was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not respond at all. "Then, in my experience, wisdom and stubbornness are more closely related than either would like to admit." She looked at him, and he was looking at her, and they were closer than they had ever been. The two chairs angled toward the fire, the small table between them, the firelight making everything intimate and specific, and for a moment neither of them looked away. "I blamed myself," Edmund said. The words came without preface, without the usual careful construction, as though the storm had worn down the architecture of his reticence, and this was simply what lay beneath it. For Isadora, she had been unwell for several days before the fever took serious hold. And I was in London. Estate business. I came back when the doctor's letter reached me, and I came as quickly as I could, but it was—" He stopped. His hands on the chair arms were very still. "She was gone before I arrived. I was not there. A beat. I have not forgiven myself for that." Elara felt the weight of those words settle into the room with the gravity of something that had been carried a very long time and set down for the first time in a strange and unfamiliar place, not quite sure yet whether it was safe to stay. "Edmund." She kept her voice very quiet, very steady. "You were in London. You were not informed immediately. You came as quickly as a man can come. None of those are failures. I should have been there." "Yes," she said, because she was not the kind of woman who offered false comfort where honest acknowledgement was what was needed. "You should have been, and you weren't. And that is a real loss and a real grief, and you are allowed to carry it. But carrying it as guilt, carrying it as a verdict against yourself. That is a different thing. That is a punishment you have chosen. She paused. She would not have chosen it for you. The fire flared briefly, brilliantly. Edmund's face, in that sudden light, was that of a man coming to the surface of something very deep, breaking through with the gasping, disoriented quality of someone who has been underwater long enough to forget what air tastes like. "How can you know that?" he said. His voice was rougher than usual, stripped of its careful modulation. "Because of the embroidery," Elara said simply. He stared at her. "In the morning room," she said. "The unfinished piece on the frame. You've left it there because it is unfinished, and you cannot bring yourself to either complete it or remove it. But I have looked at it, at the pattern she was working, the color she chose, the care in the stitches that are there. And the woman who made those stitches was not a woman who would have wanted the man she loved to spend 3 years in a house of mourning blaming himself for the mechanics of geography." She held his gaze across the fire-lit space between them. "She sounds like someone who would have been very annoyed about that, actually." Something happened on Edmund Ashford's face then that Elara had not seen in the weeks she had been watching him with careful and assiduous attention. It was not the not-quite smile she had observed before, and it was not the raw grief she had seen in the portrait gallery, and it was not the controlled remoteness that was his default. It was something that preceded all of those things, something more fundamental and more vulnerable than any of them. He laughed. It was brief, and it was rough, and it had grief in it as much as anything else, but it was a laugh, a genuine and involuntary laugh, surprised out of him by the image of Isadora being annoyed, because apparently that image was precisely accurate enough to be funny even now, even in all this pain. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then it faded, leaving behind a face that was, somehow, more open than it had been, less defended, as though the laugh had been a door, and the door, having opened once, could not entirely close again. They sat together by the fire as the storm spent itself against the walls of Ravenmore Hall, talking in the way that people talk when the usual rules have been suspended by weather and darkness and the accumulated pressure of too many careful silences, honestly, tentatively, with the fragile courage of two people discovering that the territory between them is not, as they had both assumed, entirely impassable. She told him about her mother. He told her about his first year at Ravenmore as a young duke, 22 years old, and entirely terrified and completely unable to admit it. She told him about the period after her father's disgrace, the particular shame of watching a good man be made small by men who were not half what he was. He told her that Isadora had found him reading alone in this very library on the night of a party he could not bring himself to join, and had sat in that very chair. He gestured at the chair Elara occupied, and informed him that solitude was a reasonable preference, but isolation was a bad habit, and she intended to cure him of it. "Did she?" Elara asked. "Mostly," he said, and this time the not-quite smile reached his eyes. When the storm finally quieted, somewhere past midnight, the wind retiring with the abruptness of something that has made its point and considers the matter concluded, they became gradually aware of the lateness, the dying fire, the return of ordinary reality. Edmund stood, and she stood, and they faced each other across the hearthrug in the low, warm light of the embers. The distance between them was perhaps 3 feet, perhaps less. "Thank you," he said. For, he stopped, and she understood that he did not quite have language for what had happened in this room tonight, and she did not require him to find it. "Good night, Edmund," she said. "Good night, Elara." Her name, her given name, in his voice for the first time. She carried it upstairs with her through the dark and quiet corridors of Ravenmore Hall, and she set it beside her mother's portrait on her nightstand, and she lay in her vast bed and listened to the last of the storm move away across the moor, and she did not bother, this time, to tell herself to be careful. It was, she had decided, definitively too late for that. There is a particular cruelty in falling in love inside a life that was designed, from its very foundation, to have a fixed ending, because every moment of tenderness becomes simultaneously a gift and a countdown, and joy and grief begin to arrive together, so intertwined that a person cannot feel one without the shadow of the other falling across it. Spring came to Ravenmore the way it always came to the north, tentatively, apologetically, as though not entirely certain of its welcome after the severity of what had preceded it. It arrived first as a loosening of the light, the afternoon sun gaining a quality it had lacked all winter, something almost golden, something that suggested warmth was not merely a memory, but a forthcoming reality. Then came the first crocuses along the drive, purple and white, and startlingly brave against the still cold earth. Then the moor, which had been monochrome since October, began to recover its color in slow, incremental washes, the green returning to the grasses, the brown softening, the whole vast expanse beginning, reluctantly, and then with increasing conviction, to believe in spring again. Ilara watched all of it from the windows of Raven Moor and from the paths of the estate grounds and felt, in the warming air, the complicated sweetness of a woman who is happy in a place she is only borrowing. Because something had changed after the night of the storm. Something that could not be unchanged, though neither of them had named it or acknowledged it directly. Because naming it would have required them to confront what it meant within the terms of an arrangement that had no provision for it whatsoever. Edmund sought her out now. That was the clearest and most undeniable way to describe it. He sought her out, with an intention that was quiet but unmistakable. The way a person moves toward warmth without always being consciously aware that cold was what drove them. He appeared in the library in the afternoons with increasing regularity, sometimes with correspondence, sometimes with estate ledgers, occasionally with nothing at all save the apparent desire to occupy the same space. He walked with her on mornings when the weather permitted, falling into step beside her along the gravel paths with the ease of a habit that had been forming longer than either of them had noticed. He asked her questions about her reading, about her childhood, about what she thought of this or that, with the genuine curiosity of a man who has discovered that another person's mind is, to him, genuinely interesting. And he listened, still always, with that complete and focused attention that she had come to understand was one of the most Edmund things about him. The way he gave his whole presence to whatever held it, when he chose to give it at all. Small things accumulated. She noticed them all and catalogued them with the helpless precision of a woman who knows she is doing herself no favors and cannot stop. He remembered, without being reminded, that she took her tea without sugar and with a quantity of milk that Mrs. Doyle had privately described as generous. He began leaving books outside her sitting room door again, not randomly, but with a pointed specificity that suggested he was paying attention to what she was reading and what she might wish to read next. He disagreed with her opinions on occasion, which he found, perversely, more intimate than agreement would have been, because he disagreed thoughtfully, carefully, with the particular respect of someone who thinks your opinion worth contesting rather than simply accepting. Once in the library, they had argued for the better part of an hour about whether the scientific method was a sufficient framework for understanding human experience, Ilara arguing that it was not, that there was a category of truth accessible only through feeling and not through observation, Edmund arguing with rigorous precision that feeling was itself a form of observation and therefore not exempt from empirical consideration. She had said that was the most predictably ducal thing she had ever heard. He had said that was the most predictably mystical thing a physician's daughter could possibly assert. They had both been laughing by the end of it, and the laughter had faded into a silence of a quality she had no safe word for, warm and specific and far too aware of itself. He had touched her hand twice. She counted, because she was that person now apparently, a woman who counts the times a man's hand has made contact with hers as though cataloging evidence. The first time was incidental, their fingers brushing over the same book spine in the library, a contact of perhaps 2 seconds that he had not acknowledged, and she had not mentioned. The second was deliberate, unmistakably, undeniably deliberate, when she had slipped on a patch of wet gravel during their morning walk, and he had caught her elbow, and then, when she was steady, had not immediately released it, his hand remaining at her arm for a long moment while he looked at her with an expression she did not have language for, but which she felt, rather than saw, like a change in temperature. He had released her arm. They had continued walking. Neither of them had spoken of it. This was the shape of it, this thing with no name that lived between them, that they had tacitly agreed not to examine too directly, the way one avoids looking straight at a bright light because doing so causes damage. They moved around it and through it and alongside it with a careful coordination of two people managing something fragile, And it was, in its way, one of the most profoundly tender experiences of Alara's life, this unspoken, unacknowledged thing that was also somehow the most honest thing she had ever been a part of. But she knew, she had always known, had never permitted herself to forget it for more than an hour at a time, what the arrangement said. She was here for a purpose. The purpose was not yet fulfilled, because she was not yet with child, and the particular awkwardness of that biological reality was something she and Edmund had negotiated with mutual careful delicacy that she suspected might have been almost comical from the outside, and was from the inside an exercise in emotional complexity she had not previously imagined herself capable of surviving. But the arrangement remained. She would bear him an heir, and she would leave, and Ravenmore Hall would continue its life without her, and Edmund Ashford would continue whatever version of existence he chose to inhabit after she had gone. She thought about leaving more and more as spring deepened, not because she wanted to. She was grimly honest with herself about that, but because she understood with increasing clarity that the longer she stayed in the warmth of what was growing between them, the more catastrophic the exit would be. She had agreed to leave. She intended to honor that agreement. She was simply, quietly, privately, and with the kind of grief one feels for a loss that has not yet happened, beginning to practice for it. She was in the garden on an afternoon in late March, her hands in the soil of the kitchen garden, where she had taken to spending time since discovering that growing things was a reliable comfort, when Edmund came and stood at the edge of the path and watched her. She was aware of him before she heard him, which had become characteristic. He had a presence that announced itself to her senses before the conventional ones caught up. "You're gardening," he said, as though confirming a fact that surprised him. "Observant," she agreed, without looking up from the soil. "Your natural philosophy training, I assume. You're getting dirt on your dress." "I am aware." She sat back on her heels and looked up at him, squinting slightly against the mild spring sun. He was standing with his hands in his coat pockets, his habitual severity softened by the afternoon light, and he was looking at her with that expression, the one she had no safe word for, and she felt it, as she always did, like a hand pressed gently against a bruise. Sweet and painful in equal and inseparable measure. "Ilara." He said her name as though it required some effort, or as though the effort was itself the point. "I want to," he stopped. "Start it again. There is something I need to say to you." She waited. The kitchen garden was very still around them, the new growth very green, the air carrying the clean smell of turned earth and the distant smoke from the hall's chimneys. "I am aware," he said carefully, "that the terms of our arrangement have not changed. I am aware that you entered into it with clear eyes, and that I did as well, and that what was agreed between us was agreed honestly and remains." He paused again, and she could see him searching for the precise word that would carry his meaning without carrying too much else along with it. "Remains in force." "Yes," she said quietly. "It does. I want you to know," he looked away from her for a moment, out over the garden wall to where the moor stretched away in its new spring colors. "I want you to know that I am aware of what these months have been." "What this?" He stopped again. "Edmund." She said his name with the gentle firmness of a woman who has learned that sometimes the kindest thing to do with a struggling speaker is to meet them somewhere before they exhaust themselves in the effort. "I know." He looked at her. "I know," she said again. "And I want you to know that She paused and felt the particular vertigo of a person standing at the edge of something significant, deciding in real time how close to the edge they can afford to go. "I value these months, whatever they are and whatever they mean within the terms of what we agreed. I value them." It was not everything she might have said. It was not, if she was honest, anywhere close to the full truth of it. But it was what was possible to say without crossing into territory that would require them both to stand in that territory and deal with what they found there. And she was not sure, was not at all sure, that standing there together was something the architecture of their arrangement could bear. Edmund held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved through his eyes, complex and deep and not quite resolvable in the time it occupied his face. Then he nodded a single deliberate inclination of his head and looked back at the garden. "You should wear gloves," he said, "for the soil." She looked at her dirt-covered hands and then back up at him. "Is that genuine horticultural advice or a displacement activity?" The corner of his mouth moved. "Both," he said, which was possibly the most honest word she had heard from him. And she laughed. And he stood in the spring garden listening to her laugh, as though it were a sound he was making a memory of. And she felt it, his listening, his remembering. And her laughter softened into something that was quieter and more serious and still, despite everything, irresistibly warm. She found the property listings that afternoon. She had not been looking for them. She had gone into the village with Mrs. Doyle for the quarterly household accounts, and a copy of a regional gazette had been left on the counter of the solicitor's office, with a page of property listings visible, and her eye had fallen on a small farmhouse in the listing almost without meaning to. 3 bedrooms, a garden, reasonable terms for purchase, 40 miles from Ravenmore, close enough to Heswick that her father could be settled comfortably, far enough that the exit would be clean. She had looked at it for a long time. Then she had looked away. Then, on the carriage ride home, she had asked Mrs. Doyle, with all the casualness she could manufacture, whether the Gazette was available by subscription. Because she was going to leave. She had always been going to leave. She had simply, for a few months, in the warmth of a spring that had no right to be as beautiful as it was, allowed herself to exist inside the life she was living without always thinking about its ending. That was over now. She could feel it. The way you feel a season turning, not in a single moment, but in the accumulated evidence of many small moments, the light changing, the air changing, the whole world quietly rearranging itself in preparation for what comes next. She went to the library that evening and sat in the window seat and did not take a book. She sat with her hands in her lap and watched the last of the spring light leave the sky over the moor, and she thought about 40 miles and 3 bedrooms and a garden, and she thought about the kitchen garden and her dirt-covered hands, and the way Edmund had said both as though honesty, having surprised him, had decided to stay a little longer. And then she pressed her forehead against the cool glass of the window and closed her eyes and allowed herself, for exactly as long as the last of the light lasted, to feel the full weight of loving someone inside a life that was built to end. Then the light went, and she straightened, and she went to dinner. She wore her best dress. She sat in her corner of the table, and she talked about natural philosophy, and Edmund argued with her about empiricism with the focused pleasure of a man who has discovered that argument, in the right company, is a form of closeness, and she let herself be entirely, completely present for every moment of it. Because she was leaving. Probably soon, and she intended, in whatever time remained, to waste absolutely none of it. There is a moment, singular, suspended, entirely outside the ordinary passage of time, when a woman understands that her body has made a decision on behalf of her future, and the world she thought she knew reorganizes itself around that understanding with a quiet, irreversible completeness that no amount of preparation could have made less astonishing. Ilara knew, on a Tuesday morning in early April. She had not been looking for the signs, which perhaps explained why they arrived with such authority when she finally stopped and paid them proper attention. The tiredness that was unlike ordinary tiredness, bone deep and specific, as though her body were conducting an enormous and industrious project entirely without her conscious participation. The mornings that had become difficult in ways she had attributed, with increasingly strained credibility, to the variable quality of early spring weather. The particular sensitivity that had settled over her senses, the smell of the breakfast room coffee, which she had always found pleasant, suddenly almost overwhelming, the textures of things beneath her fingertips somehow heightened, everything around her slightly too vivid and too present, as though the world had been redrawn in a heavier line. She sat on the edge of her bed on that Tuesday morning with her hands folded in her lap and the early April light coming through her curtains in long pale bars. And she was entirely, completely still for a very long time. She was with child. The contract was fulfilled. She thought these two things in sequence, one after the other, and the gap between them, the distance between the miraculous and the transactional, was one of the most desolate spaces she had ever occupied. Because both were true simultaneously, without contradiction and without mercy, and the fact of their simultaneous truth meant that the thing she had spent 7 months loving, carefully and quietly, and without ever quite allowing herself the full vocabulary of it, was now approaching its designated conclusion. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed. She told no one for 4 days. For days in which she moved through Ravenmore Hall with the surreal doubling of a woman who is carrying a secret that will change everything and has not yet decided how to carry it into the open. She walked her morning walks. She sat in the library. She argued with Edmund about Rousseau over dinner. He thought Rousseau romantically impractical. She thought Edmund's objection to Rousseau romantically revealing. And she laughed at the right moments and listened with her whole self and was present, as she had promised herself she would be, for every minute. Edmund noticed something. Of course he did. He was Edmund. And he paid attention to her now, with the helpless thoroughness of a man who has stopped pretending he is not paying attention. He watched her across the dinner table with a careful and searching quality, as though he were conducting an assessment he had not been commissioned to conduct. He asked once if she was well. She said she was perfectly well, thank you, and redirected the conversation to the Rousseau argument, and he let her, but the searching quality in his eyes did not entirely resolve. On the 5th day, she asked Mrs. Doyle to summon the physician from the village. Dr. Hartley was a compact, capable man of middle age who had clearly spent enough years in country practice to be thoroughly unsurprisable, and he confirmed, with brisk professional efficiency and what she suspected was genuine warmth behind the professional exterior, what Alara had already known. Perhaps 8 weeks along, he estimated. Everything appeared entirely as it should be. He would call again in a month, and in the meantime she should rest well, eat well, and avoid the more strenuous of her morning walks on days when the ground was uneven. He left. Alara stood at the window of her sitting room for a long time. Then she went to find Edmund. He was in his study, which was where he spent his mornings, the familiar room of dark paneling and wood smoke and ordered ledgers, the room where he had first laid out the terms of their arrangement with the surgical precision of a man who had believed, at that time, that human experience could be reliably contained within a well-drafted document. He was standing at his desk when she knocked and entered, and he looked up with that particular quality of attention he reserved for her now, immediate and complete, the ledgers ceasing to exist the moment she appeared in the doorway. Alara. He registered something in her face and straightened, setting down his pen with slow deliberateness. What is it? She stood in the doorway of his study and looked at him. This man with his dark hair and his deep-water eyes and the not-quite smile that she had earned, over 7 months of patience and honesty and shared library evenings, the right to occasionally produce. And she felt the full weight of what she was about to say settle across her shoulders like a winter coat put on against a cold she had known was coming. I am with child, she said. The silence that followed was unlike any silence she had experienced at Ravenmore, and she had experienced a considerable range. It was a silence with mass and texture, a silence that occupied the room with the same presence as furniture. Edmund did not move. He stood absolutely still behind his desk, his hand resting on the surface beside his abandoned pen, and looked at her with an expression that she watched change, slowly and involuntarily, through a sequence of things she catalogued with the helpless precision of her own breaking heart. First, something that was unmistakably piercing gladness, not performed, not considered, but immediate and instinctive, the gladness of a man who had wanted something for a long time and has just been told it is real. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Then, something more complicated, something that looked at the gladness and understood what the gladness meant within the terms of the document that lived in the drawer of the desk between them, and what it would cost. She watched him understand this. She watched the gladness become complicated by it, dimmed by it, though not extinguished, dimmed the way a lamp is dimmed when a shade is placed over it, the light still present, but now contained, now managed. Then, the composure, returning like a tide, covering the complicated gladness the way water covers sand, smoothing the surface, reasserting the familiar geography of his controlled and careful face. I see, he said. His voice was very even. That is good news. Everything proceeds as planned. He paused. You are well? You are both well. Perfectly well, she said. The doctor seemed pleased. Good. A beat. Good. He said it twice, as though the first time had not quite convinced him. He looked at his desk, at the pen beside his hand, at the middle distance between them. I will instruct Mr. Graves to begin reviewing the settlement arrangements. There is no urgency, of course, but it is sensible, to have matters in order in good time." Ilara looked at him across the study, across the dark-paneled room that still smelled of wood smoke and old books and the mineral cold of the moor, and she understood, with the clear and merciless precision of a woman who had spent 7 months learning how this man's face worked, that he was doing what he always did when feeling became too large for the containers he had built for it. He was retreating into logistics. "Of course," she said. Her voice was steady. She was very proud of how steady it was. "There is no urgency." She left him there with his pen and his ledgers and the arrangement that they had both apparently decided, in this moment, to honor exactly as written. She walked back through the corridors of Ravenmore Hall, past the portrait gallery where Isidora's violet eyes looked down from the end wall, past the morning room with its unfinished embroidery, past the door to the east wing that was closed and locked, and had been for as long as she had been here, and she climbed the stairs to her own chambers, and she sat in the chair by the window that looked out over the moor, and she put her hand, very gently, against her still flat abdomen. "Hello," she said quietly, to the new and extraordinary fact of a life beginning inside her. "I don't know yet what things will look like by the time you are old enough to understand them, but I want you to know, right now at the very beginning, that you are not a contract. You are not an arrangement or a clause or a means to an end." She paused. "You are entirely, completely, and already wanted. By me, whatever else happens." The moor spread out beyond her window in its April colors, the green returning with increasing confidence, the sky wide and pale and beginning, just barely, to believe in warmth. A curlew called somewhere in the distance, its sound carrying across the open land with the particular clarity that spring mornings produce when the air is still enough to carry things. Edmund retreated. It was not dramatic. Nothing with Edmund was dramatic, by temperament or by design, but it was unmistakable. The mornings in the library became less frequent. The dinners, while still conducted at the closer setting that had become their custom, were quieter, the conversation more careful, more surface level, as though they had both agreed without discussing it to lower the depth at which they were operating. He was present, and he was courteous, and she recognized it for what it was, now, without any remaining ambiguity, afraid. She understood the fear. She had spent enough time learning the architecture of this man to understand that love for Edmund Ashford was not a comfortable or straightforward country. It was a country he had visited once and been devastated by, and the devastation had been so complete and so formative that the mere suggestion of re-entry caused all his considerable personal resources to mobilize in the direction of prevention. The irony, which was not lost on her, and which he suspected was not lost on him either, though she doubted he would acknowledge it, was that his fear was its own kind of testimony. A man who felt nothing would not be afraid. Only a man who felt a great deal, who knew precisely what great feeling cost, would construct defenses of this elaborateness against the possibility of feeling it again. She began her arrangements quietly. She had not missed the implication of his instruction to Mr. Graves to begin reviewing the settlement, and she was not a woman who waited to be told twice. She wrote to the agent whose name she had obtained through the village solicitor and inquired about the property she had noted in the Gazette in March, the farmhouse with 3 bedrooms and a garden 40 miles distant, close enough to Heswick for her father. The agent wrote back promptly and with encouraging news. The property was available. The terms were as advertised. She did not sign anything. Not yet. She simply kept the correspondence in the drawer of her dressing table and tried to think about garden beds and her father's restored reputation and the particular pleasure of a house that was quietly, genuinely, entirely her own. She tried quite hard not to think about the library, about the window seat and the shared firelight and Rousseau and natural philosophy and the sound of a man laughing, briefly and involuntarily, at something she had said about his dead wife's embroidery. She was not always successful. There was one evening, a mid-April evening, the light lasting longer now, and the air through her window carrying the first real warmth of the approaching season, when she came downstairs to find Edmund standing in the entrance hall below, his coat on, clearly having just returned from the estate grounds. He looked up when he heard her on the stairs, and for just a moment, one unguarded, unmanaged, utterly human moment, his face did the thing she loved most about it. It became entirely honest. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he has decided he cannot keep. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then he looked away and said something about the north field drainage and went to his study. And she stood on the stairs with her hand on the banister and her heart conducting its own entirely private devastation. And she told herself, for the 100th time, with the diminishing conviction of a woman who is running out of ways to believe her own arguments, that this was the correct outcome. This was what they had agreed. This was what was right. She told herself these things very firmly, and then she went to the library, and she did not take a book, and she sat in the window seat and watched the long April evening light lie down across the moor, and she held her secret and her sorrow together in the same 2 hands, the way one sometimes must hold things that cannot be separated. 2 days later, a letter arrived from Mr. Graves, addressed to her, formal, precise, outlining the terms of her settlement, the property allowance, the annual income, the conditions under which the arrangement would be considered complete. It was everything they had agreed. It was generous and fair and entirely correct. She set it on her dressing table beside the property agent's letter. She looked at both of them together for a long time. Then she placed her hand against her abdomen again, against the small and extraordinary life that was growing there, quietly and with great dedication, entirely indifferent to the complicated adult world surrounding it. And she made herself, with great deliberateness, think about what came next. What came next was the birth. What came after that was the leaving. She pressed her hand more firmly against the warmth of her own body, and she said very quietly, to the life that could not yet hear her, but that she addressed anyway, because there was no one else in the room who needed to hear it. Whatever happens, you will know you were loved. From before the beginning, that I promise you. The moor lay vast and green beyond her window, and the April light was very beautiful, and Alara Voss, Duchess of Ravenmore, woman with a contract, woman with a departure date, woman entirely and helplessly in love with a man who was too frightened to say so and too honest to pretend otherwise, wept quietly and thoroughly for exactly as long as she needed to. Then she dried her eyes, straightened her spine, and went downstairs for dinner. She wore her best dress. She listened to Edmund talk about the north field drainage with the focused attention of a woman making memories. She was leaving soon. She intended, until the moment she left, to waste absolutely none of it. There are moments in a human life that divide everything that exists into 2 categories, what came before and what comes after. And the division is so absolute, so complete, that the person standing at that threshold can never quite return to who they were on the other side of it, no matter how hard they try, no matter how much the before had felt like solid ground. The child came in the first week of October. It was in the particular irony that life occasionally produces with the precision of a craftsman who knows exactly what he is doing. Almost exactly 1 year to the day since Alara had first arrived at Ravenmore Hall in a hired carriage with a single trunk and the folded stillness of a woman who had learned to be afraid quietly. 1 full turning of a year, autumn to autumn, cold to cold. And the woman who climbed the stairs of Ravenmore on that October evening, slow and heavy and certain that something enormous was imminent, was so fundamentally different from the woman who had first stood in this entrance hall, that she might have been an entirely other person, except that she still held herself with the same deliberate steadiness and still wore the same expression, present, clear-eyed, braced for whatever came. Next, the labor was long. This was the first thing, long and serious, and conducted in the great bedchamber, that had been prepared with all the efficiency and care that a well-run household could provide. Mrs. Doyle managing everything with the quiet authority of a woman who has been through this before and understands that the most useful thing in a difficult room is calm. The doctor was summoned from the village. Maids moved in and out with water and linen and the focused industry of people who have been given tasks and are grateful for them. Edmund paced the corridor outside. Alara knew this. She could hear him occasionally through the pauses between her own harder moments. The deliberate, measured sound of a man walking the length of a corridor and returning over and over, with the patient relentlessness of someone who has nowhere to go but cannot be still. She found in some distant and ripe part of herself that remained operational even through the considerable demands of the hours she was living through, that this was entirely characteristic of him. He could not be in the room. Convention and practical sense both prevented it. And he could not be far away. So he walked the corridor, back and forth, the full length and back, all night. She did not allow herself to think about what that meant. She was rather occupied. The child arrived in the gray hour before dawn, that particular threshold of the night when the dark has not yet surrendered, but has clearly decided to, and announced itself to the world with a sound of such indignant vitality that Alara, who had spent the final hours of the night in a place beyond ordinary feeling, came back into herself with a jolt of recognition so profound it was almost like being born herself, her child. Alive and present and furious about it in the way of all new things dragged suddenly into cold air and light. She heard Mrs. Doyle say something to the doctor in a low voice. She heard the doctor's response, brisk, clinical, but with an undertone she could not immediately identify. She heard the particular silence that followed, a silence of a different quality to the one she was accustomed to at Ravenmoor, not the silence of grief or restraint or careful distance, but the silence of a room holding its breath around something it has not expected. "Your Grace," the doctor said, and his voice had the careful quality of a man choosing his words with great deliberateness. He brought the child to her, cleaned now wrapped, still making its displeasure known to anyone within range, small and red-faced and absolutely, staggeringly real. "You have a daughter." A daughter. Alara had known, with the irrational certainty that sometimes arrives without evidence and proves itself anyway, that the child would be a girl. She had known it for months in the private way, that one knows things that cannot be proven, and she had loved her in that particular and formless way throughout, not abstractly, not as a category, but as this specific and irreplaceable person who was becoming herself in the extraordinary darkness of Alara's body. She had loved her, and she had feared for her, and she had talked to her in the quiet hours, and she had not once, not for a single moment, thought of her as a clause in a contract. "Hello," Alara whispered, which was what she had said to the idea of her 4 months ago in this same room, and what she said now to the reality of her, heavier and warmer and more completely herself than any idea could have been. "There you are. I have been wondering about you for quite some time." The child opened her eyes. The room went still. It was Mrs. Doyle who made the sound, barely a sound at all, more an intake of breath that was 1 degree past ordinary, a breath that carried inside it the very specific weight of recognition. The doctor, who had attended Ravenmoor during Isadora's final illness and knew, therefore, what he was looking at, said nothing at all and simply looked, with the expression of a man watching something he cannot explain but cannot deny. The child's eyes were violet, not blue. Not the ordinary blue that newborn so frequently present, but the precise and extraordinary shade that lived on no ordinary spectrum, that particular not quite blue, not quite gray, that Alara had stood before in the portrait gallery 10 months ago, and thought associated only with storms, and with paintings of dead women, and with the description of something she would never see in living form. The color that Isadora had carried in her eyes, and that the artist had rendered with such specific care, because it had been worth that care. Because it was the kind of color that, once seen, reorganized a person's understanding of what eyes could be. This child had them. This child, who was half Edmund Ashford and half Alara Voss, who had no biological connection to Isadora whatsoever, whose arrival in this coloring was something the doctor, if pressed, would have described as a remarkable coincidence, and privately thought of in rather more astonished terms, had opened her eyes in the gray pre-dawn of Ravenmoor Hall and looked at her mother with Isadora's eyes. Alara looked into those eyes. She thought distantly that she should be disturbed by this, that it should carry some quality of strangeness or unease. It did not. Looking into her daughter's eyes, Alara felt only the overwhelming, specific, entirely uncomplicated love of a mother for a new person, and beneath it, something quieter, a sense irrational and inarguable, and not something she would have said aloud to anyone except possibly her mother. Had her mother still been living, that this was not coincidence, that the world, which was occasionally and unexpectedly precise in its arrangements, had been precise here for a reason she could not yet see, but that she trusted, obscurely, was real. "Will you?" she said to Mrs. Doyle, and did not need to complete the sentence. Mrs. Doyle went to the door. She heard the footsteps stop in the corridor. The pacing, which had continued without intermission through the night, and which she had tracked through her hardest hours the way a sailor tracks a lighthouse, ceased. She heard the low sound of Mrs. Doyle's voice, and then silence, and then the door opened. Edmund came into the room with the quality of a man entering a space he is not entirely certain he has the right to be in, careful, deliberate, every movement considered. He had clearly been awake all night. His coat was gone, and his cravat was loosened, and his hair, always so precisely ordered, had been disarranged by some hours of running his hands through it in the manner of a man managing his anxiety by the most direct available physical means. He looked in this state, stripped of the usual armor of impeccable presentation, younger than she had ever seen him, more vulnerable, more real. He looked at Alara first, a thorough, searching look that moved across her face with a specific quality of someone reassuring themselves about something that had frightened them very much. "You are well," he said. It was not quite a question. "I am well," she confirmed. He let out a breath that had clearly been held for some time. Then he looked at the child. Alara watched him look at his daughter for the first time, and she watched what happened to his face when he did, and she understood, with a clarity that comes from spending 10 months learning how this man's face worked, that she was witnessing something private and enormous and not entirely containable. He came to the bedside. He looked at the small wrapped person in Alara's arms, at the red face and the dark hair, and his expression was moving through things she had not seen there before, things that had no names in the careful vocabulary of restraint he had spent 3 years constructing. Then the child opened her eyes again. Edmund went absolutely still, not the controlled stillness he deployed as armor, not the deliberate, constructed stillness of a man managing himself. The stillness of a man who has been struck somewhere so fundamental that the ordinary mechanisms of self-maintenance have simply stopped. The way a clock stops when its spring is spent, everything suddenly arrested at a single moment. He looked at those eyes, at that color, that specific and impossible color, and Alara saw what it did to him. She saw the grief move through his face first, swift and devastating. The grief of a man suddenly confronted by a beloved face he had been keeping at distance in a locked room and a portrait frame and 3 years of determined, punishing removal from himself. And then she saw something else, something that the grief made space for unexpectedly, in the way that grief sometimes clears a person down to bedrock, and bedrock, being the foundation of everything, is also the place from which new things can begin. He was shaking. She saw it in his hands, which had come up to grip the bedpost with a white-knuckled conviction of a man needing something solid, and in the line of his shoulders, and in the extraordinary stillness of his face, which was the stillness of a man using everything he had to remain upright in the presence of something too large for ordinary standing. "Edmund," Alara said quietly. He looked at her. His eyes were bright with something she had not seen there before, something that a more contained man might have managed to prevent, but which Edmund Ashford, stripped of coat and composure and sleep by a night of corridor pacing, was currently unable to contain with his usual efficiency. "May I?" His voice was not steady. She had never, in 10 months, heard his voice fail to be steady. "May I hold her?" Alara held up their daughter. Edmund took her with the careful terror of a man who has not held a new person before and understand that he is handling something irreplaceable. Both hands, both arms, the instinctive curling posture that human bodies seem to know independently of experience, as though the holding of small new lives is something written into the body at a level older than learning. He held his daughter against his chest and looked at her face, and those impossible violet eyes looked back at him with the serene, unfocused gaze of a person who has just arrived and is still taking stock. The sound he made was very small. She almost did not hear it. A breath expelled against the top of his daughter's head that carried inside it everything he had been holding for 3 years with his prodigious and exhausting personal discipline. The grief and the guilt and the love that had nowhere to go, and the loneliness and the particular agony of a man who believes, in the deepest and least rational part of himself, that he does not deserve to begin again. Alara watched him hold their daughter, and she watched the last wall come down. It did not come down loudly or dramatically. It came down the way the best walls fall, not in an explosion, but in a slow and inevitable and quietly magnificent subsidence, stone by stone, each one released by the simple, biological, undeniable fact of a small person breathing against a man's chest and looking at him with eyes that said, without words and without malice and without any awareness of what they were communicating, asterisk, I am here. I am real. And I am yours, asterisk. He stood there for a very long time. The room was entirely quiet around them. Mrs. Doyle had withdrawn with the discreet instinct of a woman who has worked in this house long enough to know when a room needs to be left to the people in it. The doctor had gone. The dawn was beginning now, genuinely beginning. The gray resolving into the first pale gold of morning light that came through the tall windows of the bedchamber and fell across the floor in long bright bars. When Edmund finally looked up from his daughter's face, his eyes met Alara's, and she saw it. Entirely, completely, unambiguously, the thing that had been living between them for months under all the names they had not given it. Undisguised now, unmanaged, real in the way that only things which have survived their own most difficult night are real. He opened his mouth. She saw him searching for language, this man who was so precise with words, who had spent his whole adult life ensuring that words did exactly what he required them to do, and no more. And she saw him find, in the particular exigency of this moment, that precision was not what was needed. I cannot let you go, he said. 3 words, or 6, or the entire history of the 10 months between them compressed into a single sentence that was not elegant, and not considered, and not at all the kind of thing Edmund Ashford said, which was precisely why, standing in the October dawn of his daughter's first morning in the world, it was the most true thing he had ever managed. Alara looked at him. At this man holding their daughter in the new morning light, his voice undone, and his face unguarded, and his eyes saying what they had been saying for months to anyone paying close enough attention. And she felt the full, complicated weight of it, the joy, and the grief of the joy, and the fear, and beneath the fear, steady and warm and absolutely certain, the love she had been carrying since a winter storm had made the world simple. She did not answer. Not yet. She was very tired, and the morning was very new, and some things, the most important things, deserved to be said when both people were standing on solid ground. But she reached out her hand, and Edmund Ashford, Duke of Ravenmore, holding his daughter in the golden first light of an October morning, looked at that extended hand for one moment, and then, with the careful deliberateness of a man making the most considered decision of his life, he took it. There is a difference between a man who has felt something and a man who has decided to act on it. And the distance between those two positions is sometimes vast enough to swallow everything, if he is permitted to retreat back into himself before the feeling has been properly anchored to the earth. Alara knew this. She knew it because she knew Edmund. And knowing Edmund meant understanding that the open and undone man who had stood in the dawn light of their daughter's first morning, holding the child and saying the truest words he had ever managed, was the same man who would wake the following morning in his own chambers in the opposite wing and look at himself in his shaving mirror and begin, with the quiet and methodical efficiency of long practice, to reconstruct the walls. She gave him 3 days. 3 days in which she recovered, resting as the doctor had instructed, allowing Mrs. Doyle to fuss with the particular warmth of a woman who had waited a long time for this house to contain something worth fussing over. 3 days in which she held her daughter and fed her and learned the specific and astonishing geography of this new person, the small hands, the dark hair that had Edmund's tendency toward disorder, the violet eyes that looked at the world with a seriousness that was almost comical in something so recently arrived. 3 days in which Edmund came to the nursery each morning and stood at the cradle and held the child with a stunned, reverent attention of a man who cannot yet believe the thing in his arms is real, and then left and said nothing consequential to Alara, and retreated to his study and his ledgers and the logistics with which he had always made himself unavailable to feeling. On the 4th morning, she rose before breakfast, dressed herself without the maid, and went downstairs. She had the correspondence from the property agent in her hand, the settlement letter from Mr. Graves. She carried them not as weapons, but as documents. As the paper evidence of a conversation she intended to have honestly and without ambiguity, because she was Alara Voss, and she had never, in the whole of her complicated life, managed to leave the true thing unsaid, and she was not about to begin now. She found him in the study. He was at his desk, as always, the morning ledgers open, the correspondence sorted, the entire apparatus of a man who uses work as architecture deployed with customary precision. He looked up when she entered, and she saw it immediately, the guarded quality that had returned to his eyes, the careful and reconstructed composure, the Edmund of the first weeks back in residence, behind the face of the Edmund she had come to know. She sat down in the chair across from his desk, the same chair she had occupied on the second night of her residence, when he had laid out the terms with surgical precision, and she placed both documents on the desk between them. He looked at the documents. He looked at her. "The settlement is in order," he said. His voice was the measured voice, the composed voice. "Mr. Graves has confirmed the property is available and the terms are as agreed. There is no urgency, naturally. Your health must be the primary consideration, and the doctor has recommended at least 6 weeks before." "Edmund," she said. He stopped. "I am going to say something to you now," she said, "and I am going to say it once, clearly, without qualification, and then I am going to give you the opportunity to respond honestly. Can you do that?" A pause. "I can attempt it. I am in love with you." She watched his face receive this, watched the careful composure encounter a force it had not been specifically constructed to resist, the way a wall built against weather encounters water, which does not attack, but simply finds every available opening and persists. "I have been in love with you, I think, since a storm in January, though I resisted naming it for as long as I could manage, because naming it, within the terms of this," she touched the edge of a settlement letter, "seemed an act of deliberate self-destruction." She paused. "I am naming it now, because I have recently held our daughter for the first time and discovered that she has made me significantly braver than I was before she arrived. And because you stood in that room 4 days ago and said something true to me, and then spent 3 days retreating from it. And I love you far too much to let you do that, without at least making the full situation clear to you." Edmund was very still. "I am not saying this to alter the terms of our arrangement," she continued, steadily. "If you tell me honestly that what you said in that room was the emotion of an extraordinary moment and does not represent a considered position, I will honor our agreement entirely. I will take the settlement and the property, and I will raise our daughter with every resource available to me, and I will speak of you to her with nothing but truth and respect. I am prepared for that." She met his eyes. "But I am not prepared to leave this house without having said what is true. Because I made a promise to myself that I would not waste a single moment of whatever time I had here, and saying the true thing to you before I go is part of that promise." The morning light came through the study windows and lay across the desk between them, across the ledgers and the correspondence, and the 2 documents that represented, in their formal and careful language, the life she had agreed to leave. Edmund looked at those documents. Then he looked at her. Then he did something she had not anticipated, which was that he stood up, walked around the desk, and went to the window that looked out over the drive and the grounds beyond, the same view she had first seen arriving in a hired carriage on an October morning with a single trunk and the practiced stillness of a woman who could not afford to fall apart. He stood there with his back to her, and she let him, because she understood by now that Edmund Ashford sometimes needed to look at the middle distance in order to find the words for the near. "I am afraid," he said. His voice was quiet and completely without its usual containment. "I know. When Isadora died," he stopped. Began again. "When she died, the removal of her was so complete and so final and so absolute that I understood for the first time that love of that kind is also a form of catastrophic risk. That to love someone entirely is to construct, simultaneously, the precise instrument of your own potential destruction." A pause. "I decided I would not do it again. It seemed the only rational response." "It is a rational response," Elara said. "It is also a response that will result in you spending the rest of your life in a house that is safe and empty and has very good library facilities." A sound from him, brief, involuntary, the ghost of a laugh that had surprised itself into existence. He turned from the window. He looked at her across the study. This woman in the chair across from his desk, with her hands folded and her spine straight and her eyes entirely clear, who had walked into his house a year ago with nothing but her intelligence and her honesty and her refusal to be made invisible, and had proceeded, without apparent effort or strategy, to dismantle every single wall he had spent 3 years constructing. And Edmund Ashford felt, moving through him with the force of something that has been damned for far too long, and has finally found the opening it required, the full measure of what he had been very carefully not feeling for the past 10 months. It was enormous. That was the thing. It was simply enormous and warm and terrifying, and more real than anything he had permitted himself to feel since the morning he had arrived home from London to a house that was already quiet in the wrong way and understood, before anyone told him, what that quietness meant. "I have been doing it anyway," he said. The words came out rough and unpolished and entirely without their customary precision. That is what I need you to understand. I decided I would not do it again, and I have done it anyway. And the only result of the decision has been that I have felt everything I was trying not to feel and refused to call it by its name while simultaneously failing to prevent it from being exactly what it is. Alara looked at him. "And what is it, Edmund? Say it plainly." He crossed the room. Not quickly, deliberately, with the specific quality of a man walking toward something he has decided to stop running from, each step considered and each step chosen. He stopped in front of her chair and looked down at her, and she looked up at him, and the morning light made everything very clear. "I love you," he said. I have loved you, I think, since you stood in my portrait gallery and told Isadora's portrait you were not there to replace her, which is something I was not supposed to witness, and which I have thought about almost every day since." He paused. "I am afraid of it. I intend to be afraid of it, and to proceed regardless, if you are still." She stood up. And she was very close to him, and she put her hand flat against his chest, against the place where his heart was conducting its very undignified and thoroughly felt proceedings, and she looked at him with the clear, steady eyes of a woman who has been carrying the weight of loving someone in silence for 10 months, and has set it down at last. "Yes," she said. Simply that. One word, which contained everything the 2 documents on the desk behind them had tried to conclude and couldn't, because some things are not concluded by documents, but only by people choosing each other in the plain light of an ordinary morning. Edmund put his hand over hers, the hand she had pressed against his chest, and held it there, and she felt his heartbeat beneath her palm, rapid and real and human and present, and she thought, "Asterisk, there you are. I have been wondering about you for quite some time, asterisk." He reached past her with his other hand and picked up the settlement letter and the property correspondence from the desk. She watched him take them to the fireplace. She watched him place them in the grate. She watched the documents, the formal, careful, legal record of everything they had agreed to begin with and been too limited in their imagining to conclude correctly, catch and curl and become light. "I will have Mr. Graves draw up different papers," Edmund said, watching the fire. "Ones that do not involve 40 miles of distance, and a property I have never visited, and an arrangement that was the act of a man who had decided to stop living and was trying to make the decision look practical." She stood beside him at the fireplace and watched the papers burn. "That is possibly the most self-aware thing you have ever said." "I have been practicing," he said, and looked at her sideways, and the not-quite smile was there, the one she had spent months earning the right to produce. But it was more than that now. It was complete. It was a real smile, whole and unguarded, and directed at her with the full force of a man who has stopped managing himself and started simply being himself, which was, she thought, one of the finest sights she had ever seen. She took his hand. He held it, and they stood together by the fire in the morning light, and the papers finished burning, and the house around them was quiet in a way that was not the quietness of grief or absence or preserved rooms and locked doors, but the quietness of 2 people who have said the true thing and are standing in the aftermath of it, which is the particular silence of something beginning. Above them, in the nursery that Mrs. Doyle had prepared with such care and hope, their daughter lay in her cradle with her dark hair and her violet eyes and the serene indifference of a new person who has not yet discovered that the world is complicated, and who was, in her small and complete and entirely ordinary extraordinariness, The most persuasive argument either of them had ever encountered for the proposition that things which seem finished are sometimes simply between one form and the next. There is a principle, Elara thought, in natural philosophy, that nothing is created and nothing is destroyed, only the form changes. She had read it in a book left outside her door. She had thought about it for months. She thought she understood it now. There are endings that arrive with fanfare, with declarations that echo through halls and gestures so grand they demand to be witnessed. And then there are the quieter endings, the ones that do not so much announce themselves as settle, gently and irrevocably, into the spaces left open for them. Ravenmore Hall had always understood quiet endings. It was early morning when Edmund Ashford finally understood that he had been mistaking silence for strength and absence for survival. The frost still lay across the drive in a thin, crystalline veil, catching the pale light of dawn and turning the world momentarily fragile, as though everything might shatter if touched too carelessly. He stood at the threshold of the great doors, his breath visible in the cold air, and watched the carriage at the far end of the drive as it made its slow, deliberate progress away from the house, away from him. Elara had not made a spectacle of her leaving. That perhaps was the clearest indication of who she was, that even in departure, she chose dignity over disruption. Her things had been packed quietly. Her farewells to the staff had been warm but contained. To him, she had left only a note, brief, precise, entirely in keeping with the terms of the arrangement they had both entered with such clarity, and were now discovering had never truly been so simple. The heir is born. The agreement fulfilled. I leave you with what you asked for, and more than I intended to give. Take care of her. Take care of yourself, if you can. There had been no accusation in the words, no plea, no demand, only truth. It was that truth, the absence of any attempt to hold him, to persuade him, to make him choose, that broke something open inside him with a finality he could no longer deny. He had thought himself a man shaped by loss. He had believed that grief had carved him into something unyielding, something permanent. But standing there, watching the woman who had walked into his life as a solution and become something infinitely more disappear into the pale morning, he understood, with a clarity so sharp it bordered on pain, that grief had not been the thing that defined him. Fear had. Fear of losing again. Fear of loving again. Fear that if he allowed himself to step beyond the boundaries he had so carefully constructed, the world would take from him what little he had left. And so he had done the most dangerous thing a man could do with fear. He had built a life around it. Behind him, somewhere deep in the house, his daughter stirred. A small, unmistakable cry breaking the stillness of Ravenmore with a quiet insistence of life that refuses to be ignored. It carried down the corridor, through the great hall, and reached him where he stood. He turned. The nursery had once been a room of storage, unused and unnecessary. Now it held a cradle, a fire that was always kept burning, and a presence that altered the very air of the house. The nursemaid stepped back as he entered, sensing something in his expression that required no interference. The child lay in her cradle, wrapped in soft white, impossibly small and entirely real. His daughter. He approached slowly, as though proximity might somehow undo the certainty of her existence. But she remained, her tiny hands curled, her breath soft and steady, her eyes closed in the untroubled sleep of someone who had not yet learned the weight of the world. He reached out, hesitated, and then, with a care that surprised even him, lifted her into his arms. She stirred at the movement. Her eyelids fluttered open, and there they were, the violet eyes. Isadora's eyes. For a moment, the past and the present collided so completely that he could not separate them. The memory of a woman he had loved with everything he was, and the undeniable reality of the child in his arms who bore that memory in her very being. He had thought this would destroy him. He had thought that seeing those eyes again would reopen every wound he had spent 3 years trying to contain. But the child did not carry Isadora's absence. She carried something else entirely. She was not a reminder of what he had lost. She was proof of what remained. Her fingers, impossibly small, impossibly certain, closed around one of his. And in that simple, instinctive gesture, something within him shifted with a finality that no storm, no argument, no quiet moment in a library had yet managed to achieve. Love, he realized, was not something that could be preserved in locked rooms or confined to the past. It moved. It changed. It demanded to be lived in the present, or it turned into something brittle and unrecognizable. He looked down at his daughter, at the life that had come from an arrangement he had believed to be purely practical, purely controlled, and understood, with a certainty that left no room for hesitation, that he had been wrong. About everything that mattered. He handed the child back to the nursemaid with care, his hands lingering for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, as though committing the weight of her to memory. Then he turned and left the nursery with a purpose that felt unfamiliar and entirely inevitable. The drive stretched before him, the frost beginning to melt under the growing light. The carriage was no longer visible, but the tracks it had left were clear, cutting a path through the white like a decision made and not yet beyond undoing. He did not call for a horse. He did not summon a servant. He went himself. The cold bit into his lungs as he moved down the drive, his pace quickening with each step, the careful composure that had defined him for so long falling away in the face of something far more urgent. By the time he reached the bend where the road curved out toward the moor, he could see it again, the carriage, slowed by the uneven ground, still within reach. He called out. The driver reined in the horses. The carriage came to a halt. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened. Ilara stepped down onto the frost-hardened earth, her expression composed in the way she had learned to be composed when something mattered too much to risk showing it. They stood facing each other, the distance between them filled with everything that had been said and everything that had not. I honor my word, she said quietly. I know, he answered. His voice was not steady, but it was honest. And I am asking you to let me break mine. Something flickered in her eyes. Not hope, not yet, but the possibility of it. He took a step closer. I thought I could build a life that required nothing from me except endurance, he said. I thought I could arrange the world in such a way that I would never have to risk feeling what I felt before. He shook his head, a small, almost disbelieving movement. I was wrong. The wind moved across the moor, softer now, carrying the first true promise of spring. I cannot offer you certainty, he continued. I cannot promise that I will not fail you in ways I have not yet imagined. But I can tell you the truth, and the truth is this. I do not want a life in which you are not in it. Ilara held his gaze, searching his face with the careful attention of someone who has learned not to trust words without their weight behind them. And what of her? She asked softly. He did not pretend not to understand. She was my past, he said, and she will always be a part of me. But she is not my future. His voice softened, something gentler threading through it. You are. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of decision. Ilara looked at him for a long moment, at the man who had summoned her as a solution, and now stood before her with nothing but the truth. And something in her expression shifted, the careful restraint giving way to something warmer, something braver. Then tear it up, she said. He did not ask what she meant. He reached into his coat, withdrew the folded contract he had carried without quite knowing why, and without ceremony, without hesitation, tore it in two. The pieces fell between them, carried briefly by the wind before settling into the frost. A bargain ended, a choice made. Ilara stepped toward him, and for the first time, there was nothing between them that had not been chosen. Behind them, Ravenmore Hall stood as it always had, stone and history and memory. But something within it had changed. It no longer mourned. It remembered. And in its rooms, in the quiet spaces where grief had once settled like dust, a different kind of life began to take shape, one not built on absence, but on the fragile, extraordinary courage of staying.